Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I've got two mini PCs to review and they are almost identical in terms of CPU and RAM and storage, and so we are just going to review both of them in the same video here today. And so today we're going to talk about the Beelink SER9 as well as the MinisForum EliteMini AI 370. They both have that next generation AMD Strix Point CPU, which is more AI minded, but also does really well when it comes to gaming and emulation. And of course, that's what we'll focus on in this review. And so for me, as a potential buyer of mini PCs like this, I've got a couple questions that I would like to answer by the end of this video. The first is, what can we expect when it comes to gaming and emulation with this next generation CPU? And then I also want to know which one is going to be the best fit for you between these two options. Even though they look similar, there are quite a few differences between them that may be make or break depending on what you're planning on using it for. And then finally, I want to get to the heart of the matter of this new CPU because it is quite expensive compared to the previous generation, at least right now. And so my third question is whether or not it's even worth around $1,000 to get this new CPU, or if you're better off getting the other ones from last generation that are around $600 instead. Either way, I love making videos like this. It gives me an excuse to play a bunch of PC games, but then also it's just fun to poke around with the newest technology. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start by talking about what's the same between these two mini PCs. And number one has to be the CPU, which is the AMD Ryzen AI 9 HX370. And then it has to be one of the worst names I've ever heard for a chipset. It definitely feels like it's been written by AI. Now, the codename for this generation of CPUs is Strix Point, and they have 12 cores and 24 threads, and it has a 5.1 GHz max boost clock. It also has integrated graphics, the AMD Radeon 890M. This is what they call RDNA 3.5, and it's got 16 cores and it runs at 2900 MHz. Now, in addition to the CPU and integrated GPU, the RAM and storage are the same between these two models. They both have 32 gigs of LPDDR5X RAM clocked at 7500 MHz. But bear in mind that with this CPU, the RAM is soldered onto the board, which makes it non-upgradable. Thankfully, it is 32 GB standard on these models, and so it's going to be plenty for gaming. In terms of storage, they each have two M.2 2280 slots, and one of those slots will be filled with a 1TB drive. So the nuts and bolts are the same, but let's talk about what's different between them. We'll start with the Beelink SER9. This one is programmed with a 54-watt TDP out of the box. In addition, the Wi-Fi chip inside is a bit older. It's the Intel AX200, which is Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. It also has a 100-watt power brick and is unique in that it has internal speakers. Now, the MinisForum EliteMini AI 370 is a little bit different. It is configured with a lower TDP, only 45 watts versus 54, but it does come with a newer Wi-Fi chip, which has Wi-Fi 6E as well as Bluetooth 5.3. It also has a slightly larger power brick, it's 120 watts, and it also has dual LAN ports that are both 2.5 gigabit. In terms of pricing, they're about the same. It is kind of hard to tell exactly what they're going to be priced at just because we're in the middle of Black Friday and Cyber Monday season. But regardless of whatever sale that's going on right now, I've seen these mostly selling for around $1,000. So right now the Beelink SER9 is $950, but the MinisForum is $1,000 after you use the $100 off coupon. So in this video, we are just going to treat these as $1,000 mini PCs, give or take a little bit depending on when you try to buy it. Now, I don't know about you, but $1,000 is a lot for a mini PC, way more than I would be comfortable buying. If we look at other PCs that have this same CPU chipset, they're mostly going to be laptops because this is a laptop CPU. But if you look through those from Asus and MSI and HP, all of these are going with the same AI 370 chipset for $1,700 or more. Now, obviously, a laptop is going to cost more than a mini PC. It has a screen and a battery and keyboard. But my point here is that I don't think that any of these companies are trying to rob us of all of our money. I think this is just what they're paying AMD in order to get these chipsets. And so yes, this is an expensive CPU no matter where you get it, either in a laptop or a mini PC. The big question here is whether or not that performance is going to be worth it, which obviously we're going to dive into in this video. But before that, let's do an unboxing. Now, both of these were sent over from their respective companies for review. But like in all my videos, all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Now, I'm going to spare you the pain of watching me unbox two different mini PCs. Let's just dive into the contents. And you can see that each of them have something a little bit different going on. The Beelink is definitely more bare bones. We've got an HDMI cable, the power brick, and then a quick start manual. The MinisForum also has a quick start guide and a power brick and an HDMI cable, but it also comes with a VESA mount. And so you have the hardware here to connect it to the back of a monitor. Now let's talk about these power bricks because they are each a little bit different. They are both barrel plug adapters, but the Beelink one is a little bit smaller. It's one of those brick plugs, which means you got to plug it into a power strip or into a wall outlet. And like I mentioned, it has a 100 watt output altogether. And between the two, this one's probably more travel friendly because it is small and simple. Now the MinisForum one is a little bit more complex. In addition to the barrel plug and its cable, it has an additional Mickey Mouse style cable that you will plug into the other side of the adapter. This can be good or bad. It makes the overall cable a lot longer, and also you don't have to worry about plugging a brick into your power strip. And so if you are short on space when it comes to plugging into your outlet, then this might be a better deal. And like I mentioned, this one is 120 watt output. So when it comes down to it, which one you prefer is going to be up to you, but I personally like the MinisForum one better. I like having more power to work with and then also not having to plug a brick into my power strip. So now let's do some quick first impressions of each PC. Starting with the MinisForum, this one is actually metallic looking plastic, so this one is hollow all the way around. It has a more lightweight and somewhat cheap feeling, but I like the fact that it is so light. By contrast, the Beelink has an aluminum shell. It feels very sturdy, but also quite heavy. It reminds me a lot of a Mac Mini. The MinisForum weighs 473 grams, which is just a little bit more than 1 pound. Meanwhile, the Beelink is 811 grams, which is like 1.8 pounds. So this is almost twice the weight of the MinisForum. So if traveling around with your mini PC is a priority, for example, you're going to be taking this around with you on trips, then the MinisForum might be a better deal just because it is about half that weight. Now let's talk about the front I/O. These each have CMOS reset buttons as well as a power button, and then also a 3.5mm headphone microphone jack. They also each have USB-C, but the Beelink only has 10 gigabit USB 3.2. On the MinisForum, it's a full USB 4, which is going to be 40 gigabits per second. In addition, the MinisForum has two separate USB-A 10 gigabit ports, while the Beelink only has one. And so when it comes to easy access to ports on the front of your PC, I think the MinisForum is definitely winning here. It's got that full USB 4 port to give you faster transfer speeds, and then also you've got dual USB-A ports, which can be pretty handy. I also like the design on the front of the MinisForum more than the Beelink. The Beelink has those 4 holes up above. Those are microphone inputs, so if you wanted to use this for conference calling, that's what you would use it for. Personally, I think it looks just a little bit odd, and I don't plan on using the built-in microphone either. So as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to the front, I think the MinisForum has more functionality and looks better. Now looking at these sides, the MinisForum has ventilation, whereas the Beelink does not. Now to start, the Beelink actually has 3 USB-A ports on the back. The 2 bottom ones are USB 2.0, but the one on the left up top is 3.2. Meanwhile, the MinisForum only has 2 USB-A ports, but these are 3.2 Gen 2. But the kicker here is that the Beelink has a USB-C port on the back, and this one is full USB 4, so 40 gigabit per second. Other than that, they have their power plugs and then also 2.5 gigabit LAN ports. The MinisForum has 2, whereas the Beelink only has 1. We also have HDMI and DisplayPort. These are capable of 8K 60Hz or 4K 120Hz. And then finally, the Beelink also has a headphone microphone jack on the back, which I think is also handy. So when it comes to the back ports, I actually think the Beelink is quite a bit better. Personally, I don't need 2 LAN ports, but I do want to have as many USB ports as possible. This one has 3 USB-A ports, but then also that USB 4 port on the back. And personally, if you are going to have USB 4, I would prefer to have it on the back. That way you can plug it into an external display or maybe a hard drive to have really fast speeds. Also, having a headphone microphone jack on the back means you can plug it into, for example, external speakers without having any cables in the way. So when it comes down to it, I do like the front of the MinisForum better, but I like the back of the Beelink one better. And if I had to choose which I/O overall I would choose, it would be the Beelink one as well, especially because all of the great I/O on the back. Personally, I can live with only having 1 USB-A port on the front, and those 4 microphone holes, even though they are a little bit ugly, are easy to overlook. Now looking at the bottom, these are both basically designed with ventilation in mind. The Beelink one is a little bit more work because it has these little pads covering up the screw holes. Also, the MinisForum has those 2 screw holes if you want to connect this to the back of a monitor, which I think is great. But all in all, the design here is relatively the same. Let's do a quick teardown and see what it looks like inside. We'll start with the MinisForum. This just requires 4 Phillips head screws, and once you take off the back cover, it's just a matter of taking off this heat shield. It's not actually attached by anything other than these 2 pieces of fabric tape. So once you pull that off, there you go. We can now get inside the internals. Now there's not a lot going on here, but this is where you will upgrade the storage. As you can see, we've already got our 1 terabyte stick right here, but you could put a second stick right next to it. And the max for each of these slots is going to be 4 terabytes. Now underneath our storage drive is going to be our Wi-Fi card. So if you ever need to swap this out or repair it, this is how you would access it. And other than that, there's not a lot else going on. We've got some thermal padding that can attach to the M.2 drives, and that's about it. And my only other note is that this heat shield is relatively thin, so I'm not sure how much heat it's actually dissipating. Either way, it is easy to get in and out of the MinisForum. Now the Beelink is a little bit more work, but not much. You do have to remove those rubber pads over these screw holes, but after that it's just 4 Phillips screws. And we do have this nice tab which we can pull to remove the bottom very easily. Now underneath that we have a dust filter, which I think is pretty cool. They've been doing this for a while now. And it also comes with its own speakers, which is pretty rare with a mini PC. Now these are not like huge speakers, and I've tested these same speakers on other mini PCs from Beelink before, but let's do another test now. We're going to start with music, and this is going to be at 75% volume and just taken right here from the microphone. So overall, obviously the music is audible, but I would say it sounds quite muffled, all things considered. It could definitely work in a pinch, but I would say the audio here is not great. Let's do another example, but this time with a vocal recording. Now, before we jump into my favorites, let's set a couple ground rules. The first is that every handheld shown here today was released in 2024. There have been a bunch that came out in 2023 and are still awesome. And so again, this was at 75% volume, and you can hear that it is quite muffled and somewhat distorted. You have to remember that the audio here is going out through the bottom of the shell. Because this thing is made out of metal and there's not a lot of ventilation, it's just kind of reverberating inside of the case. So when it comes down to it, I like the fact that there are speakers inside. I think it's better than not having speakers, but it's still not something that I would actually enjoy using. Anyway, we got 2 more screws to take off to get off this dust filter, and now we can actually get into the internals. And here's a look at these speakers, and yeah, these are exactly the same as I've tested before. Now on the right side is where our M.2 drives are, and you can see we have a big old thick metal heatsink. This thing is held into place by 2 additional screws, but after that you can pull it off, and yeah, you can see here, there's our 1 terabyte storage drive. And this one looks to be Phison branded, which is a reputable brand as well. Now to the right of that, you can see our additional storage drive bay if you wanted to add another drive, and then also we have our Wi-Fi card. So I think this card is even easier to access than on the MinisForum. So long story short, when it comes to just the overall teardown process, I think that the Beelink one is just a little bit more straightforward. Yes, it's got a couple more screws to use, but I like the fact that it has a nice big heatsink, and that dust filter is pretty cool as well. Okay, now let's talk about size, and they are relatively similar, but one is bigger than the other. If we use our standard Kerrygold butter measuring kit, you can see that yes, this one's a little bit over 2 sticks of Kerrygold butter. Meanwhile, the Beelink is also 2 sticks of Kerrygold butter, but a little bit more. So I would say there's probably a 10 or 15% overall difference in size, but for me it's not that big of a deal. They're both still smaller than the width of an Xbox Series controller, and that's pretty good in my book. And even if you stack them one on top of the other, you can see that it's barely a difference at all, and so I would say that they are roughly the same size, but the MinisForum is a little bit smaller. Okay, so now let's go in and actually start testing these mini PCs in terms of performance and everything else. Now, because we are testing 2 PCs at once, I did have to come up with a way to basically label the 2. And so I came up with a couple different things. Obviously, I'll put some text on the screen if it does get confusing, but one of the keys that I am using here is different background colors. So you can see I have a Beelink one and then also the MinisForum one. And I actually made these desktop graphics myself, and I am terrible at graphic stuff like this, and so I'm pretty proud of it. Anyway, let's start with our first series of tests. We're going to talk about things like CPU temperature, and then also using a CPU intensive benchmark. And this will also give us an idea of overall fan noise. So we're going to jump into Cinebench R23 and then use Core Temp at the same time to monitor heat. And this is a 10-minute test, and I did it for both of the 2 machines. Now, the first thing worth noting when doing these tests is that they do run at different TDPs like I mentioned earlier in the video. So the MinisForum runs at 45 watts, whereas the Beelink runs at 54. And when it comes to CPU-related tests like this, I think that extra power will make a difference. And when looking at the results, you can see that yes, these scores are different. The Beelink got a score of 20,118, whereas the MinisForum got 18,884. So it's not a huge difference between the 2, but if you are looking for CPU-related tasks, then at least the default settings on the Beelink is going to be better. Now, the other thing worth noting other than the scores themselves themselves are the temperatures. If you look here near the bottom, you can see we have min-max scores. So this is going to be the minimum and the max that they hit during the test. And you can see that the MinisForum, even though it is clocked at a lower TDP, actually got quite a bit hotter. So this one ran all the way up to 92 degrees Celsius at its peak point. Meanwhile, the Beelink never got past 82 degrees Celsius. And personally, my rule of thumb is that anything above 90 degrees Celsius is a little bit warm for me. So not only did the Beelink run at a higher TDP and also get a higher score, but it ran at a lower temperature. Now the other factor involved in cooling is going to be fan noise. And we'll start with the Beelink, just getting it at idle, and this is going to be between 40 and 41 decibels. And this is about the noise floor of my studio room. I've got a big old window next to it and lots of traffic. And so at idle, I really just could not hear this mini PC operating at all. Now, after running the Cinebench test for about 5 minutes, it did get a little bit louder, but not by much. I would say that it maxed out at about 43 decibels, which is going to be just a little bit more than the noise floor. Let me give you a sample and see if you can hear it. Now it's going to be similar with the MinisForum. This one's also around 40 to 41 decibels, but I will say that I could kind of hear this one while on idle. Now once the test kicked in, it did get quite a bit louder, somewhere between 49 and 50 decibels. And at this level, it is absolutely audible. I wouldn't call it loud, but you can definitely hear it. Let me give you another sample, which I think you'll be able to pick up here on the mic. So when it comes down to it related to CPU tasks, then I think that the Beelink is quite a bit better. Not only did it score better in benchmarks, but it also ran cooler and quieter. And so if you're looking for a mini PC that's going to be based on CPU related tasks, you know, things like video and audio editing, then I think the Beelink will probably be a safer bet. I think they'll both do great, but the Beelink just seems a little bit more stable. Now this is a gaming focused channel, so I want to focus on the gaming. Let's start with some benchmarks. We're going to start with the 3D Mark Time Spy score. And this is where things get really interesting. Even though the Beelink does run at a higher TDP, you can see that the actual results and score are about the same. The CPU score is a little bit higher on the Beelink, but not by much, and the overall score is almost neck and neck. So at least when it comes to GPU intensive benchmarks, then yes, even though the MinisForum is at a lower TDP, the performance is about the same. Let's do an in-game benchmark next with Horizon Zero Dawn. Now this one was also very similar. I'm running this at 1440p with the original settings, and I got an average frame rate of 36 FPS with the MinisForum. And if you look at the score in the top right, it is a 6540. Now switching over to the Beelink, we have the exact same average frame rate of 36 frames per second, and the score is just a little bit higher, 6563. So again, we're looking at performance that is basically neck and neck between the two. So now let's actually start testing out some games, and I did the exact same games, the exact same settings to see if I could find any difference. And when it came to performance, I basically could not see a difference at all. However, one of the main things to look out here is going to be the GPU temperature, which you can see on the top left. And on average, I would say that the MinisForum runs about 15 degrees hotter than the Beelink. So the performance is about the same. With BioShock Infinite, we're getting 1440p high settings and a stable 60 frames per second. The only main difference is the temperatures, and you'll see this trend going on as we keep testing. Let's move on to Control. This time we're going to play it at 1080p in low settings. This game is notoriously hard to play at 1080p, but I have tested this game with this same chipset before, and I know it can handle it. And sure enough, even when I'm wreaking havoc in this room right here, we're still getting a pretty stable 60 frames per second. It'll dip down here or there, but still totally enjoyable. Moving on to another former AAA title, let's talk about Doom Eternal. This one I'm running at 1080p ultra settings, and I'm getting an average frame rate of 75 to 80 frames per second, so I think that's pretty great. And finally, one other 1080p game, let's try Cyberpunk 2077. So this is 1080p medium settings, but with FSR3 enabled. Here we'll get an average of between 55 and 45 frames per second, depending on what you're doing. If you're just running around the street, it'll be around 55 frames, but if you're actually in the middle of a fight, it'll drop down to 45, which I still think is pretty good for this game. And so these are the settings that I personally would use when trying one of these mini PCs and running Cyberpunk 2077. But also note that the MinisForum is running about 15 degrees hotter on average. And I wouldn't call these unsafe temperatures, and it's definitely not causing any sort of throttling, but it is something to be mindful of when it comes to overall long-term use. Okay, so now I want to move into 1440p gaming, which is crazy to think that we could even do that with integrated graphics. But here we are with Horizon Zero Dawn 1440p original settings, and I'm getting an average frame rate about 30 to 35 frames. It's obviously not 60 frames per second, but it's still pretty high, and it looks great. Let's Let's do the same thing with Marvel Spider-Man, 1440p low settings this time, and with FSR3 enabled just to kind of help us out. And I'm actually in the middle of a mission right here, so I've got people like looking for me and shooting at me. It really kind of bogs down the gameplay, but I'm still getting well over 30 frames per second. Again, it's more in the cinematic category than actually like fast action gaming, but I could definitely play this at 30 frames per second. It's a similar experience with Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Again, 1440p low settings, FSR3 enabled, but we're getting well over 30 frames per second. And so again, this is one of those where I would just lock it at 30 and then enjoy a very stable experience, and I think this will be worth it. And then finally, the last game I wanted to test out just because it is good for benchmarking is Witcher 3, 1440p low settings, no FSR or anything else like that, and 60 frames per second pretty stably. It would dip down to like 58 here or there, but that's one of those things where I would just turn off all metrics and I probably wouldn't even notice. So long story short, when it comes to gaming, I think that you'll mostly be able to play any game at 1080p with some fiddling with the settings, and many with 1440p, which is really impressive. Okay, now I want to move into emulation. We're just going to touch on a couple of the harder to play systems to give you an idea of just how far we can take it. We're going to start with PS2, and so here's Burnout Revenge running at a 6x resolution, which is well beyond 4K. And again, we're getting a very stable 60 frames per second, no problem running this game whatsoever. Now, the temperature thing is still happening here, the MinisForum is running hotter, but performance between the two is about the same. And so long story short, depending on the type of game that you're wanting to play, you can probably play all of them in a 6x or maybe drop it down to a 5 or maybe 4x resolution. All these games are going to play well. This means that you will be able to play most games upscale to 4K or better. And it'll also be the same experience with GameCube and Wii, but probably a little bit better. Now, I'm trying to avoid any Nintendo footage on this channel for a bit, but I did want to show off this one Wii U game. This is the hardest to emulate game, and I'm just going to be calling it the Wild Boy Wandering. Either way, I've upscaled it here to 1440p, which is really nice and crisp, but we're still getting well over 40 frames per second on average. And while playing, some of these shaders are still caching, and so you might get better performance the longer you play it. Either way, this is a great demonstration that just about any Wii U game you throw at it, even this hard one here, will run really well. Okay, let's now move on to PlayStation 3 emulation using RPCS3. We're going to start at a native resolution with Ratchet & Clank Quest for Booty. This is one of the harder games to play, and usually my metric is that I want it to run over 30 frames per second easily. And you can see that these mini PCs can do that no problem. In fact, they are closer to 60 frames per second. You'll get some dips here or there, but it's still a very smooth experience, so definitely worth trying out. In fact, you can even upscale some of the easier to run games like Demon's Souls. Here I'm running it at a 3x resolution. Now this game ran originally at a 30 frames per second cap, but I've removed that cap, and even then we're still getting somewhere between like 45 and 50 frames. If you drop down the resolution, you can play this at 60 no problem, but I think it looks really good this way anyway. So now let's try one of the really hard PS3 games to play. This is God of War 3. It's running at a native resolution, but you can see that it is 60 frames per second more often than not. Like with Ratchet & Clank, this is one of those where as long as you're getting over 30 frames per second, you're not going to have any actual bog down. It's just not going to be quite as smooth. And so again here, I would say this game is fully playable, barring any sort of issues with emulation compatibility. And being able to play God of War 3 at such a high frame rate is really kind of unheard of with integrated graphics, so this is really good. And finally, the last system I wanted to test was Xbox 360. We're going to use Xenia Canary here with the 1080p turned on. And no surprises here, but this one can run these games really well. I only tried some of the harder games like Crackdown, and this one's running at a stable 30 frames per second. Same thing with Forza Horizon. And so I think when it comes to emulation, this is going to be a piece of cake. It's really going to come down to emulator compatibility at this point. As long as the game runs well with any of these emulators, it should run just fine on this mini PC. It may not be able to give you 4K upscaling like you would with a dedicated graphics card, but this is pretty impressive for integrated graphics. So long story short, when it comes to performance between these two machines, I would say it's about neck and neck. The only main difference is the temperature, and the MinisForum is about 15 degrees hotter than the Beelink. But other than that, the actual gameplay experience is exactly the same. Okay, now that we've got an idea of performance and some of those other aspects, let's start wrapping up and talk about, in general, what I like about both of these mini PCs and what I don't like, and then we'll kind of dig into the weeds after that. We'll start with what I like, and bear in mind this is for both mini PCs. And I think they are both well built. They are relatively quiet, although the MinisForum is a little bit louder, but in general, they're not like what I would call loud or anything. I also think they are pretty stylish looking. You know, there are a couple nitpicks I have about their overall design, but in general, they just look nice sitting on a desk. I like that they're very compact. I've been able to throw these in my backpack and go back and forth between the house and studio over the past month. I also appreciate that we have expandable storage, so there's an additional M.2 slot in there and it can go up to 4 terabytes. And then probably my favorite aspect of it is the performance. I think these Strix Point CPUs are pretty awesome. We're at the point where this PC with integrated graphics can outperform PCs with dedicated graphics from about 5 years ago, which is pretty crazy. Now, of course, these mini PCs are not perfect, so there are two things that I don't like about either of them. And honestly, neither of these have to do with the manufacturer of the mini PC, but just really the chip itself. Number one, this chip requires onboard RAM, so you're not able to upgrade it. It's the same thing as it is with the laptops, but it's still just kind of a pain. Thankfully, these do come with 32 gigs, so it's not a huge deal for me. And of course, the next big thing is that they're just expensive. Now, it's just the going rate of the CPU, but all the same, it's a lot of money to spend on a mini PC. Spending $1,000 on any PC is a big deal, but these cannot be upgraded in the same way that a desktop CPU could. With those tower PCs, you can refresh it with new RAM and new graphics cards, but a mini PC like this, it's basically what you're going to get. Now, in addition to just the collective mini PCs and what's good and bad about them, I did want to talk about what's good and bad about each of them as well. And so let's do a quick comparison between the two and what I like and what I don't like beyond just what we've talked about. For the Beelink SCR9, I think this one has a more solid heft and feel. It definitely feels more well built. I also like that it has more USB ports, especially those on the back, so I think the ports are better on this one. It also has better cooling. Not only is it quieter, but it also runs a lot cooler, about 15 degrees on average. And even though the speaker on it is pretty mediocre, I like the fact that we even have that option in case we want to use it in a pinch. And because the Beelink is clocked at a higher TDP, that means it's going to be great for CPU-related tasks like audio and video editing. Now, the MinisForum also has its pros and cons. This one is lighter and smaller, so if portability is an important factor for you, then this one might be a better choice. This one also has more front I/O ports, so if you plan on plugging in things like a keyboard or controller often, then this might be a better deal. I also think the MinisForum has a better power brick. It's 120 watts, and then also I like the fact that the brick itself doesn't have to plug into a power strip. And at the end of the day, the gaming performance on this one is about the same as it is on the Beelink SCR9, even though it does run a little bit hotter. Now, if we go back to the intro of this video, I also talked about another factor, and that was whether or not it's better just to get a previous generation mini PC for cheaper. So let's do a quick look at the two options that we have from the previous generation that I think are worth considering. On the MinisForum side, we've got a couple options, but I think the UM870 is the one I'm going to focus on here. It's got a Ryzen 8000 CPU, and right now, after applying a coupon, it's going to be about $450. This also comes with 32 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage, so pretty similar all things considered other than the chip. And the equivalent on the Beelink side, I would say, is the SCR8. This one has a slightly better CPU, it's the 8745HS. This one also has 32 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage and the same 780M integrated graphics. And this one's a little bit more expensive, it's about $480 right now after applying the coupon. Now, I reviewed the SCR8 before. In fact, it's still my primary Windows PC here at the studio. So this is what I use for all my video capturing and tutorials, and then also for all my voice calling and podcasting. And this has been solid as a rock over the past 6 months. I still think it's probably the best buy that you can get around the $500 price point. But bear in mind, there's a pretty big performance gap between these two generations. So let's talk about what you will get around this $450 price point. Now, if we look at the Time Spy score, it's not that much worse than the ones we were just reviewing. Those ones got a little bit over 4,000, but this one you can see is 3229. So that's going to be about a 20 to 25% decrease in performance power, at least on the benchmark. However, when you actually start getting into a game, the numbers get quite a bit worse. For example, running it at 1440p original settings like we did previously with the other machines, we can see our average frame rate is 21 frames per second versus 36. So this is running at just barely over half the frame rate that we were getting previously. And I would say that's a pretty good measurement in overall performance between the two. If you remember when playing Control earlier, we were getting 60 frames per second very stably in this exact same scene. And these are same settings and everything, 1080p low settings, and yeah, we're getting an average about 38, maybe 35 frames per second. So again, even though the price on this machine is about 50% less than the other ones, the performance is about 50% less as well. When it comes down to it, if you want to play games on this machine compared to those Strix Point ones, you will have to drop down the settings quite a bit. So for example, with Ryzen Zero Dawn, instead of 1440p original settings to get around 30-35 frames per second, we have to drop it down to 1080p low. Now, this isn't the end of the world because you can still play this game and it looks halfway decent, but it's definitely quite a bit worse than what we were seeing previously. Another good example is going to be Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. This one, instead of running it at 1440p low settings with FSR3, we have to drop it down to 1080p. And the difference between the two, even when using this upscaling technology, is still pretty significant. At 1440p with low settings, this feels like a game that I would thoroughly enjoy, much like playing it on a PS4 or PS5. Meanwhile, playing it at 1080p low settings feels like I'm just kind of playing it on a potato by contrast. So it really comes down to the idea of you get what you pay for. I think that the Beelink SER8 is still a great machine for around $500 or less. But you do have to temper your expectations because it will not perform in the same way as the PCs that we're reviewing here today. Yes, they are expensive computers, but you get what you pay for, and I think that the performance here is really outstanding. But I do really have a hard time recommending any mini PC at $1,000, especially without any sort of discrete graphics card or upgrade path. And so if anything, if you really want to get this type of performance, it might be worth just waiting about a year or so until these go cheaper. I figure by the time AMD releases their next set of CPUs, these will probably drop down in price, and that might be the time to grab them. And so in wrapping things up here, last question is probably whether or not I recommend the MinisForum or the Beelink. And honestly, between the two, I think they are both great and the performance is really impressive. But between the two, my overall experience has been that the Beelink just seems to be more stable and easier to work with. And so this is going to be my pick, is the Beelink SER9, although it was a very close race. So there we go, long story short, I think that these new mini PCs are really excellent. They're probably the best I've ever seen with any integrated graphics computers. And it is really inspiring that we're able to get this good performance without a dedicated graphics card. It almost reminds me of a few years ago when these things really started getting good, and people used to leave comments and saying, man, these are going to be even better 3 years from now. And here we are 3 years from then, and sure enough, these things are amazing. But their amazingness comes at a price, and I think that $1,000 is a lot to ask for a mini PC. At that price point, you may be better off getting a tower PC as long as you have the space for it. And I've got a couple ideas about that, but we will have to save that for a different video. For now, let me know what you think in the comments below. Are you thinking about picking up one of these more advanced next generation PCs, or do you think it's worth waiting until the price drops quite a bit? And if you are planning on waiting, what's the price point that you think is going to be more palatable? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.